Welcome to this edition of American Purpose. My name is Jack Moline, and I am president of Interfaith Alliance. 60 years ago, Henry Luce, the publisher of Life magazine, invited 10 prominent men each to compose an essay on the national purpose. Then, as now, there was a sense that we stood at the beginning of a time of cultural and political change. Our project expands on that work, as each episode explores one perspective on where our nation was, where it is, and where it should be heading, with a contemporary thought leader. My guests are from the worlds of faith, government, politics, and culture, and they have generously agreed to share this time with us. You can find out more about Interfaith Alliance and our mission to protect your faith and freedom at interfaithalliance.org and by listening to our radio program and podcast, State of Belief, at stateofbelief.com. But right now, let's find out more about the American Purpose with my guest, Dr. Tony Beam. Dr. Beam serves as Director of Church and Community Engagement and Public Affairs for North Greenville University. He also serves as the Director of the Office of Public Policy of the Southern Baptist Church in South Carolina, and the host of Christian Worldview with Tony and Austin, Austin being Austin Barker, and too many other credentials to mention, if we're going to still leave time for this conversation. So, Tony, thank you for being with us today.
It's a pleasure. I'm honored to be invited on the show.
Great. We're just going to dive right in. Let me ask you, what, in your opinion, was the original national purpose of the United States of America?
Wow. Well, it's an interesting question, because when you go back and look at our founding, there weren't any countries in existence that would follow the pattern that the 13 original colonies decided to use for our country. For example, countries were usually built around ethnic or racial ties, or if that was not the unifying purpose, then countries were built around monarchies or dictatorships or some type of strong leader that would pull the people together. So our forefathers, who were brilliant and well-educated men, decided that to try this experiment, that a country could gain national identity, a unifying purpose around an idea, not around a leader, not around one ethnic or racial type of people, but rather would rally around the idea of liberty or freedom. That kind of arose from the milieu that was in the colonies at the time. You had so many factors that played into that. You had the Great Awakening with leaders like great preachers like Edwards and Whitefield, who were preaching morality through religious conversion. And then you had this growing sense of economic independence, as well as the idea of freedom personally, that was beginning to coalesce in the colonies and came together with the Declaration of Independence, which is one of the most incredible documents ever written, because Thomas Jefferson sat down and put into words for the first time that all men are created equal, and that our rights come from our Creator. And because they are given by a Creator, they are inalienable rights that can't be taken away by an earthly leader. And so self-government, the idea of people being able to govern themselves in an atmosphere of liberty as opposed to an atmosphere of oppression or servitude, was the genius of the beginning of America.
It's a great answer. Thank you. So taking that into consideration, what do you believe is or ought to be the American purpose going forward?
Well, I think it has to remain the same. I mean, I don't think that our purpose has changed over the years. I think our purpose has become perverted by some of our founding principles either being misapplied or misunderstood or not properly protected. I don't think that the idea of freedom, the idea of religious freedom, the idea of individual freedom, the idea of capitalism, which is the idea of economic freedom, that I believe has freed more people around the world and given them a chance to pull themselves up out of poverty and create a middle class that stands between the elite, the very wealthy, and the very poor. You have this idea of the middle class. I think all of those things need to continue to be held on to. They need to continue to be offered to the rest of the world. One of the great things about America is that the idea of individual liberty and a self form of government has been taken up by other countries around the world and has led to a sense of probably more freedom for more people than any other time in human history. But when those principles begin to be abandoned or perverted, then that's when we run into a problem. So our purpose going forward, I think, should be a renewal to the commitment of the original founding principles that led to the Declaration of Independence and the establishment of the U.S. Constitution.
So you use the word freedom a lot in describing this. Will you drill down a little bit for us on how you understand that word and its application?
Well, I think liberty is more than license. Liberty that is simply license leads to chaos. I think liberty has to be something that is tempered by where we have the ability to govern ourselves. In fact, that's what our founders believed. I mean, you had men like Benjamin Franklin, who was not a paragon of religious virtue, of course, but while he was serving in France as an ambassador, he wrote a letter that to some of his friends in France, and his letter had this statement that freedom requires virtue, or rather, only a virtuous people, I should say, are capable of freedom. So, freedom, to be free, means to, first of all, we have to be able to govern ourselves, because if we can't govern ourselves, then we're going to require the strength of a powerful government to invade and hold us together. If we can't hold ourselves together through self-governance, we can't enjoy the governance that we have that gives us the freedoms that we enjoy. So I think that freedom requires virtue. There's Os Guinness wrote a book a few years ago called A Free People's Suicide, and he referenced something called the golden triangle of freedom. And this is what he said. He said, freedom requires virtue, virtue requires faith, and faith requires freedom. So as long as those things continue in a cycle, then we're able to remain free, to have liberty, but not license. Liberty is not the license to do whatever we want. Liberty is the ability to discover what's best for us individually, and then to bring that together so we can live together.
Very incisive and very helpful. Thank you for that. Our society rests on foundational values. Clearly, you believe freedom to be perhaps first among them. Some of them are admirable and some of them not so much. What are one or two of the values worth doubling down on for us in these times?
Well, I think religious liberty. And back to forms of freedom, I think we have to have religious liberty. That's something that needs, particularly, it seems to be under attack today in the West. The idea that there are some religious expressions that are out of sync with a modern understanding of right and wrong. And so for example, I'll just use same-sex marriage as an example. I understand and I accept the fact that we now live in a country, in the United States, where same-sex marriage has been declared constitutional and is therefore going to be allowed. I can live in that country as long as I'm allowed to disagree, even though it's a law. I respect that it's a law now. But if you force me to acquiesce, if you want my approval instead of my agreement with the fact that it exists, then I have to pull back, because my faith teaches me that marriage was not created by man, but was given by God, and therefore it's one of the inalienable things that I'm not able just to walk away from. So I think freedom of religion is incredibly important. I think in our culture right now, we're experiencing an attack from ultra-left progressives that an article in The Economist recently described as the illiberal left that are actually taking away our freedom of expression. That's another freedom that I think has to exist for us to continue to prosper. The right to speak our mind, the right to speak up without fear of being canceled or being undermined or being because our opinion doesn't fall within somebody's idea on the far left of being acceptable, then we have to be pushed out or pushed to the margins of society. I think that we have to really stand firm for religious liberty and the right to free expression and the right to personal liberty in our lives every day.
Yeah, I've heard that answer a lot. It shouldn't surprise you to know that I've heard it from lots of different people with lots of different perspectives. So thanks for following up on that. Are there one or two of our foundational values that are holding us back from the necessary progress we have to make as a society and a country?
You know, I think about that question, and I really can't put my finger on founding values that are holding us back. I want to go back to a previous statement that I made. I think it's the misapplication or misunderstanding of those founding values that can hold us back, not the values themselves. The values themselves were remarkable in the fact that no one had ever conceived of self-governance, the idea that people could actually govern themselves, and that would require a moral or virtuous people in order for that to happen. I don't think there's anything. Well, let me see if I can put it this way. You know, a lot of people say, okay, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence says that all men are created equal, but it was written by people who were slaveholders. And so we hear this all the time, that many of our founding fathers owned slaves, and yet they adhered to the principle of individual liberty and equal worth before God. Well, the truth is that that concept, once stated and accepted by people, was the death knell of slavery. Yeah, it didn't happen as fast as we would have liked for it to happen. It didn't happen. I mean, we had to fight a civil war over it. There were a lot of things, and as far as that concerns, women's rights and the terms of women having the vote and being treated equally, for everybody to gain equality from the world that was in existence in 1776 to where we live in 2021, it took a long time for that concept to seep into the society and the culture to reach the point that it affected everybody, that everybody began to be treated equally. But that original idea was in the Constitution. So to the extent that we hold on to that original idea, we're going to continue to prosper. To the extent that we pervert it or set it aside, we're going to have, I think, struggles, and those are the base of our struggles going forward.
Are there those founding or foundational values that need that kind of attention in our day and age, the way that equality needed between 1776 and today?
Yes. I'll go back again and talk about what I would call the far left. Mm-hmm. And I guess, to be honest, to be fair, you could say that there are people on the far right who also are saying there are certain things that you have to believe or you can't be accepted. You know, our country has been blessed with the ability to have a robust debate, primarily between conservative and liberal, and I'm talking about classical liberalism. I'm not talking about the far left type of progressivism, which I believe is tyrannical. So, I was just thinking about this morning. I actually talked about it on the radio program, that if we're going to defeat progressivism, the far left, the dangerous stuff, the cancel culture, the authoritarianism, which is building up on the far left, it's going to require intellectual honesty with conservatives and liberals, traditional liberals, coming together to push back against that far left progressivism in order to protect our liberties that we were given in the Constitution. Look, I've got there are going to be places where, as a conservative, politically and theologically, I'm going to disagree with a classical liberal. But in an environment where both of our freedom of speech is protected, and we agree that that is a something that must remain, we can have that debate and be intellectually honest and debate back and forth the virtues of classical liberalism versus conservatism. But when ultra progressiveness, the tyrannical form of progressivism that we're seeing steps in, it wants to undermine freedom of speech. It wants to take away the right. If you don't agree with their view of America, then you need to shut up. And if you won't shut up, we'll shut you up. We'll find a way to stop your speech. I think that's one of the greatest threats that we face in going forward, is to push back against those ideas.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. You know, we've been talking a lot about the Constitution as one of our as our major foundational document, along with the Declaration. Most of our constitutional guarantees emphasize our commonality, but you and I, perhaps in different spheres sometimes, work on the presumption of the first freedom in the Bill of Rights, which is very personal: religion, the freedom of conscience.
Right.
What are the values that are rooted in your personal belief system that you commend to people here that do not necessarily share your beliefs?
Wow, that's a good question. Well, I'm coming, of course, from a Christian perspective. Mm-hmm. I'm a born-again believer, and evangelical is how I describe, I guess Christianity comes in different wrappers these days. Mine would be evangelical, where I've had a personal experience with Jesus Christ. I believe that my sin has been atoned for. And so that I am that by Jesus on the cross. And then, so I'm that in that part of Christianity. And I believe the strength that brings is, I think Christians are very much are people who can restrain themselves morally, because we believe that, first of all, we need restraint, the humility to be able to admit that I'm a sinner by nature and by choice, and that if I'm left alone, I'm going to basically follow my base instincts, which are going to lead me towards selfishness, not selflessness. And so as a Christian, I believe that what God did for me has changed my heart. He has made me into a new creation, that rather than being selfish and simply being concerned about my own needs, he's turned me into someone who has been forgiven, so that I'm not carrying around this burden of guilt, which I think is very important, that particularly in our world today, where people can have a sense that they can be free. Here's that concept of freedom again, the idea that you can be free from the debt of sin, the burden of guilt of things that you feel like you've done wrong. How are you going to be free from that so that you can thrive and prosper? Well, I believe that comes through the forgiveness that we find in Jesus Christ. And then the transformation that comes as we receive that forgiveness is we become not a selfish people, but selfless. We begin to care about the needs of others. Christianity has done a lot for the world in terms of helping others, the concept of us becoming servants for each other and putting others' needs above our own. So I think those are some of the things that Christianity can give to the world that is important.
You're describing a pathway to virtuousness, which is what you've defined as essential to pursuing our national purpose.
Right. I've either got to control or regulate my behavior, or somebody's going to have to come in and regulate it for me. Now, for me, thankfully, I'm married to a wonderful woman who often regulates my behavior. But apart from her, it would have to be the government or some authority. And we're all better off. The more virtue we have, the more we can control our own impulses that would tear us apart, and the less control has to come from an outside source.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Tell me, Tony, how should our society pursue our national purpose? Do you have a prescription?
Well, I think pursuing our national purpose is going to require us to be able to talk to each other again without yelling, screaming, accusing. Now, I'm going to say something here that's a little bit strange, I suppose, as someone who does podcasts, someone who does talk radio 2 hours every morning. A lot of what is being communicated today is being communicated in a caustic way, and anger seems to be the platform that many people believe can advance them and get them attention and get them ratings and get other people to fall in line. And the Bible teaches that the wrath of God does not bring about the righteousness, the wrath of man does not bring about the righteousness of God, meaning that anger can be a good motivator if it gets you up off the couch because something has made you mad or gotten your emotions churning, that you see that's a kind of a righteous anger, that you see something's wrong and needs to be fixed, then that's fine. But if anger becomes the platform that we live on and try to advance, then we're not going to get very far. So I think our principles and our way of life, for us to advance and to get back to a place where those principles and values are front and center all the time, we've got to stop yelling and talking past each other politically, theologically, and every other way, and find a way to talk to each other, understand each other, and kind of lay down the sword, so to speak, so that we can work out our problems as long as we can work together. But if we can't find common ground, even if we have some areas of disagreement, if we can't find common ground to work together, I think we're going to stay stuck in this cycle of anger being expressed in unhealthy ways. And eventually that can lead to some bad circumstances, I think, in our world.
And what role does the individual play in pursuing that national purpose?
Well, I think that it comes down to several things. I think we have a responsibility to read widely, to be intellectually honest, to try to understand people that disagree with us without being so angry all the time. I think that, for example, I read the Washington Post. I read National Review. I read The Atlantic. I read The Daily Wire. I try to pull from what I would call legitimate sources that don't agree with me or that would actually disagree with me about many of the principles that I have. And then I try to reinforce, because I want that to challenge me. And then I want to reinforce my bedrock principles by reading things that help me to keep those things front and center. So I think the best way that individually we can push our values forward is to be the best people that we can be by being reading from a lot of different sources, allowing ourselves to be open to conversations with others about our differences. And for a Christian, for me, it's going to be a closer walk with God. The closer that I can become to the teachings of Jesus Christ, the better individually I'm going to be, and I'm going to be able to help us as a country be better, the better I am individually.
I'll tell you, the thing that first introduced me to you and to the work you do was one of the now 2 interviews that you've done as part of This American Life. And the quotation that struck me, and I've written about it, is, "My values are deeper than the culture of the moment," which I think is something I would commend to everybody, no matter what that set of values is. And I'm very glad to hear you expand on that for us.
Well, sure. I mean, my values are what guide me every day. The culture is going to be in turmoil and chaos around me. And the peace that I find is in the things, the principles and the values that I believe are most important, and I hold on to those. Look, we have a tendency politically right now to simply say, if it's our guy making a statement, then he's right or she's right no matter what. if it's their guy making a statement, they're wrong or she's wrong no matter what. And so that's not a good way to live. I'm not going to give up my values, the things that are most important to me, in order to join a politically expedient moment where I think that some movement is going to triumph if I can get behind it. I can't do that. If my values allow me to join, then so be it. But if I have to stand back a little bit because my values are not being reflected by that political moment, then I have to choose my values and my principles, the things that I hold to that I believe are eternal rather than temporary or temporal.
Are you optimistic about America's future?
It depends on what day it is. I mean, honestly, I confess I'm a bit wishy-washy when it comes to whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic. There are days when it seems that the problems pile up to a point that I just don't see how we're going to find our way out. And then there are days when it seems that the calmer voices are beginning to rise to the top. And maybe we are going to be okay. Maybe this grand experiment in self-government is going to survive. Now, I'm optimistic about the future of my future and the future of the world because I believe in God and in Jesus Christ, and I believe God has a plan and that He is sovereign, and that is going to work out for our good and His glory. So on that level, I'm optimistic. But the United States is just part of that world. And as far as being optimistic about our future, I think if we can push down the authoritarianism and the totalitarianism that's being expressed right now in our culture from elements on the far left and in some degree on the far right, if we can push those elements and find the place where we're able to have genuine intellectually honest dialogue and begin to work on our common problems again, yes, we'll get through it. We've always done that. Maybe we're going to do it again. I hope so.
Tony, this has been a remarkable half hour of conversation, and I thank you tremendously for it.
Well, thank you.
And thanks to our listeners for engaging with us and exploring the American purpose. It has been an honor and a pleasure to spend this time with Dr. Tony Beam, who has shared his perspective so generously. You can listen to this and other episodes of American Purpose at americanpurpose.org and learn more about our work at stateofbelief.com and interfaithalliance.org. Interfaith Alliance has produced this program under the guidance of Ray Kirstein. I am Jack Moline, encouraging you to live with purpose.